It starts for me about when I was 5 years old. I was born in Wilmington, Delaware, and moved to a farm in Virginia when I was 5 years old. Growing up on a farm, now I have more of an appreciation of than I did then. I'm an only son. I have three older sisters. And so I think I was probably a little, mothered a little bit, My father wanted very desperately for me to be the son to carry on the family name and that kind of thing. So I think he had his own agenda. We didn't get along very well because he wanted me to do all the things I didn't want to do, hunting and doing things of that nature. And so I didn't have much of a relationship with him, but my mother was always somebody that encouraged me to be artistic. Because I've been drawing since I was old enough to hold a pencil, and so I think she saw that early on, and she was always very encouraging about it. I would do things like cut pictures out of our encyclopedias and try to make little art projects out of that and things of that nature, and that would make my parents very angry, because I'm cutting up the encyclopedias, but yeah, so she encouraged that, and I went to a very small country school, but I had an amazing art teacher that totally give all props to for making me who I am today as an artist. She was very encouraging. She would stand over my shoulder and watch me do things and give me little tips on how I could improve things. And she would I always felt like I stood out of the class because even though I was in a classroom full of people, they all did one thing and she had me doing other things, because I felt like that she wanted to push me a little bit harder. She's the one that helped me get into college. I went to VCU in Richmond. Only for 1 year because I thought I wanted to teach art. She really inspired me and made me feel like I wanted to teach it because I thought it would have to be an incredible feeling, even if you only reached one person, to help another artist blossom, and grow and develop their own way. So I was passionate about that at first, but 1 year of school and I realized I didn't want to teach it. All the different things like art history, which I love and I enjoy, as an artist, but to try to teach that to somebody else, it just really wasn't where I'm at. So I decided I didn't want to do that. And just through things like I couldn't get another, what's the word I'm trying to say, like loan to go to school because they said my parents made too much money, but then they didn't make enough to send me to school. So I got caught kind of in that balance of that. And so I left school. And then from there, probably the other thing I need to mention that might be an important thing to say, because it helped me develop to where I am today. Having grown up on the farm, well, first of all, I'm gay. I don't know if I mentioned that or not. And I didn't know that in the beginning years of my life, meaning, I grew up on a farm. I had no role models. I had nobody that I looked up to. It was nothing we ever talked about or was discussed. To my knowledge, we didn't know anybody. And I knew I was different, but I didn't know what it was. I knew what was expected of me, but I didn't feel that way. And so I was just like, okay, just trying to go along and figure it out as I went along. And then when I went to college, that's when I figured out who I was. And and so from that point, I lived all over the place. I went back to Delaware for a while. I lived in Maryland for a while, back to Virginia, then Vermont, and trying to find my place and figure out what I want. Well, as a small child, I very much love coloring books. I was very much into coloring. Colors have always been super important in my art, and I do a lot of very vivid colors in my art. But as a child, I was always into that, and I was more into like animals and inspired by like muscle tone and things of that nature, and how some muscles look square and some are round and, all the different shapes of it. That all very much interested me as a child. Never thought I would do portrait work or anything like that. But that's kind of where it all led to be honest. And so, yeah, I was very much into animals and drawing animals and colors and coloring and doing that kind of thing as a child. And my mother was super supportive of that. In fact, every year for Christmas, embarrassingly enough, until I was probably in my 30s, I used to get a coloring book and crayons for Christmas every year. It was kind of like a family thing we did. But anyway, so I enjoyed that a great deal. And as I started getting older, I got more into portrait stuff. I really wanted to draw faces and people and bodies, and it was real important for me to get detail, and I was really big into hard lines. I didn't want to do anything soft. I wanted to really kind of get in there and lay heavy lines down and make things very definite. So my biggest challenge early on, and my art teacher, Miss Jane Blevins, I'll say that, she taught me how to be a little softer with what I was doing. You can still do hard lines and detail, but you don't have to be so hard with it or bold with it. So she really showed me that, which really helped me learn how to do a good job with form, faces and features and muscle tone and things of that nature. So when I got into my teens, it was more about that. I was doing a lot of portrait stuff, trying to do it in color, but struggling with the color when it come to portraits. To this very day, I still don't do a lot of color portraits. I have done some, but most of my portrait work is black and white. I have some pictures, it's really funny, of when I was at that age holding pictures that I've done in art shows that I've entered. And like my mother is standing in the picture with me, and you can tell just by looking at her face, this immense pride that she feels in me. She's always been that way when it comes to my art. My father never really, he was kind of artistic. He was more technical, like architectural stuff. He was good with a ruler and that kind of thing. He also did like woodworking. He made cabinetry and stuff like that out of wood. So he was big into that. So I think I got my talent maybe from his side. But he was never one to really encourage me as an artist. That I have memory of. I don't, my mother was always the one who was, pushing me to draw and do all of that. So I think she was very supportive when it come to my growth, and I think she was seeing me grow. And so, yeah, she was always very supportive of that. I honestly don't remember my age, but it was like high school. So, I guess 14, 15 years old, something like that. I remember Miss Blevins, my art teacher in high school, she asked me if I would come to her class on my study break, because we were allowed to do that. And I told her yes, I did. And when I walked in, it was just her and I in the classroom, and she had some paperwork, and it was the application to VCU in Richmond. And we hadn't talked about it prior to this moment, and she just kind of surprised me with it. And she's like, you can get into this school, and I'm going to help you get into this school. And I remember, it actually kind of gives me chill bumps a little bit now saying it again, because she was right here, and I was doing something, and she was bent over, and so she was like right in my ear kind of thing. And it was like the voice of God, for lack of better ways of explaining it. And it just kind of washed over me, and I thought, this is what she's right. This is what I've got to do. And I didn't realize until that moment how important art was in my daily life, and that need to create, where that came from. So that was probably my big moment as a teen. In my early 20s, I was still in school and college, in the throes of leaving that. And that time of my life is probably when I did the least amount of art, because I was really in the midst of figuring out who I was as a person, because my whole childhood, as great and protected as it was, to a point, I didn't know who I was. I had no idea. I didn't even know what I wanted. I just knew, I knew what I didn't want, but I didn't know what I wanted. And so from my 20 to about 26, 27 years old was a crazy time in my life, and I made a lot of stupid decisions and mistakes, and I guess as all young people do. And but I'm the kind of person that I want to try everything once, but that don't mean I want to do it all again twice. So that was what that period of my life was a lot of experimentation, some with art stuff, but a lot with just knowing my own boundaries and how far I will and will not go in different situations. And the reason that I think that that's relevant is because it has also helped me, and it's where I think I learned this, was during that period of time in my life, that I can push the boundaries and I can use mediums the way I want to use them, and I don't have to do it the way that people tell me I have to do it. And that's the thing that drives me, because I don't want to be told how to do anything. I want to figure it out myself and figure out how I want to do it and how I can make it my own. When I was in college, I loved it. It was one of the most amazing experiences in my life. Being a small town person, I really thought that was my destiny, to be stuck there. And so to go to college and have that experience, I was the only person in my family that's ever done that. It was amazing. It was hard and challenging and made me think about art in ways that I never thought I would think about art. I mean, it was mind-blowing for me. It was like a baby being exposed to a whole new world, and I couldn't absorb it enough, which was part of the reasons that I struggled with art history, because that's just so much information that I just struggle retaining that kind of thing. And so for me, it's about applying it and being hands-on, and it's all very visual for me, but to write stuff down and put stuff to memory is where I struggle. But I loved it. I loved all of my studio classes. I had live model drawing classes, and then I had some classes that made us do more collage sculptural kind of stuff, which really wasn't my thing, but it helped me have a different perspective on all of that, which I have put into use since. So yeah, it was a great time, and I honestly believe if money hadn't have been an issue, I do think I would have stayed and finished. I think my path might have changed a little, but I definitely would have stayed in school, because I loved it. I always thought school was great and enjoyed school. Even though I grew up in a household of music, we were more music than TV, let's say, even though nobody played musical instruments or anything, but it was always a big part of my life. And so I took that into, it carries on into my life even to today. But the one thing that I was super inspired with at school was all these interesting artsy people that I met, and some of them were so driven by music and the culture of the music they were listening to and how they would dress and how it influenced their art. And I just never looked at music like that. As much as I enjoy music, it never served me in that way. And so when I met these people and I saw what they were doing and how music was such a big part of that, I was like, wow, this is really helpful to me as an artist, because I've even had moments where I'm blocked and I can listen to certain music or songs and it gives me clarity that helps me see things differently. And I think I create some of my best art. Well, I want to say, because I didn't say before, I entered every art show that I could when I was in school, all the way to my senior year. That was always kind of a big thing for me. And I did really well. Surprising. I felt surprised by it, but I did really well, like won some best in shows and some blue ribbons on some stuff, and got some, recognition in the local paper. And, I tried to do things, any kind of art projects that would come up, like in the newspaper, they would want you to draw something for a advertisement or something. I would enter everything that I could and did really well. And it wasn't until I moved to Colorado when I was 28 years old, and I started showing my work. And I never thought it would ever happen, but I did, and became pretty successful at it. My first show, I'll never forget. I was actually doing abstract art, was the first art that I really showed professionally as a standalone artist, because I had met a abstract artist that suggested that I try abstract, because he's like, man, with the kind of detailed stuff you do, I think you could do really well with abstract. And I never thought I would do abstract because I never really had an appreciation for it, because I never really understood it. But I gave it a try, and much to my surprise, it was really well received. And my first show, I sold like 6 pieces, and it all just kind of went from there. And I still get very, like I said earlier, humbled when somebody wants to buy my art, because I'm like, wow, somebody loves that enough that they want to give me money for that, and it's going to hang on their wall or something. And I still find that very shocking that people see my art that way, because I really just do it for myself. And unless it's commissioned, then that is not for myself. But yeah, so my first show was amazing, and that was when I was probably 30, was my first real art show. So while I was living in Colorado, I was hanging in galleries and showing it a bunch of different stuff and doing street fairs, and I was really giving it 100%. One of the things that made me able to do that is my partner at the time was in education, and he's like, well, why don't you just try to do art full time and, try to make that work and give that, a good go. And I was like, okay. And so I started doing watercolor renderings of houses for real estate people, is where it really all started, because I had many jobs in my life, and one was a receptionist in a real estate office. And this woman came in one day with a watercolor of a house, and she asked me to give it to the agent, and I said, okay. And so I asked him, I'm like, what is this for? What do you do with this? And she said, well, we use it for advertisement and several other things. And I thought, well, I can do that. And so I started doing it. And then it got to the point where I was so busy that I was working 8 hours there and then coming home and working 7 or 8 hours at art. And I had to make a choice. And so I started doing art full time. So that's really where it started. Well, like I said, when I moved to Colorado, I met this abstract artist and he told me, to try abstract. So I did. And what I decided to use is recycled materials, thinking that, if I was going to do this, I wanted to have a direction with it. I wanted to have some kind of a purpose. I didn't want to just be creating it. It needed to be a little more than that for me. And so I thought, okay, I want to use, materials that I find, or, and again, texture is super important to me. So I wanted my work to have texture as well. And so I was getting things like scrap wood from dumpsters at construction sites and unused paint from houses that people were selling and they needed to get rid of. And so literally I would just lay these boards down and I would just start pouring paint on it. And just, I guess part of my process is that I have to look at my art a lot. And what I mean by that is I have moments where sometimes I'm my most creative when I'm just really looking at it, not actually applying paint. Because what happens for me is I get very visual in my head, and if I can stare at something long enough, I can start seeing things that I want to do to it and ways that I can develop it. And that's what abstract art did for me. It loosened me up from my tight lines and portrait stuff to this kind of free-flowing movement of color and texture. And so I started seeing this whole other world, and it was so exciting and it was so great what was happening. I had a good friend. I said, I'm going to run with this, but if I start hammering doll heads to a board, reel me back in, because then I've gone too far, because that's not where I want to take it. Because I was doing things like, I was finding like bark from trees, like big chunky thick things of bark, and I was putting that in my paintings and painting over top of it, but using that as texture. And I was trying everything. I tried flour. What does flour do when you mix it with paint? Salt, tea, coffee, dried flowers, pine needles, grass, human hair. I even had this really cool moment where a really good friend's mother passed away, and she knew that I did very heavily textured work, and she wanted something in memory of her mother. And so she actually gave me a portion of her mother's ashes and asked me to incorporate it into a painting. And so I did. And I will say this about that experience. Never have I ever worked with anything like that. And it was such a unique experience, because basically, if you know anything about cremated human remains, the ash is very, almost like baby powder. It's very fine, very soft. And then there's like chunks in there, bits of bone and so forth. And so what I did is I sifted through that, got all the chunks out, and then I mixed the ash into the paint that I was going to use, and it created this thick consistency, not as thick as applesauce, but similar. And the way that it laid on the painting, on the board, and the way that it dried, it was spectacular. It was a really awesome moment, because I've never used any other thing that does what that does to paint. It's pretty amazing. And then of course I put the bones and the bits in it as well and incorporated it in. And she just told me about her mother and what she was like and how colorful she was and colors she liked. And so anyway, I created these two paintings for her, one for her and one for her sister, that they loved. So that was a pretty big moment in my 30s, because I asked her not to, I didn't want her to see it until it was completely finished, both paintings. And so when she came to my studio, when they were done, to show them to her, we just had this moment, and I knew that it was right, because She walked in. We didn't speak a word. She looked at the paintings. We had a moment where we were emotional together. And then she hugged me and she said, "This is absolutely perfect." And she thanked me for giving her some closure on her mother passing away. So that was a really big moment for me. I've not done it since, but I'm open to it. You know, if anybody ever wanted something like that, I would do that. I just haven't had the opportunity. Well, I'll definitely say that, you know, being gay, I don't think has really influenced my art on a huge level. I think it did when I was younger and first figuring out who I was, because I was really into portrait work at the time. And so I found myself really wanting to, again, with the hard lines and the hardness of the whole thing, I found myself drawn to doing male figures. But the truth is it really wasn't that big of a part of it for me, because I'm trying to think of the best way to say this because I don't really know how to answer the question. I never thought of my work as being influenced as far as being gay. I don't feel like when you look at my work that comes across. I don't know, maybe it does. Maybe other people would disagree with me, but I don't think it does, and I don't think it's that big of an influence, because I really, to be honest with you, being gay is such a small part of who I am. It's just one of those facts, like I have blue eyes or I have brown hair, you know, I'm gay, and so that's that, you know. Just like my blue eyes don't make me want to paint blue eyes on everything, or, you know what I'm saying? I don't know, I just never felt really inspired because of that. If anything that it did do for me, it made me a little more bold. It helped me be more forward and out with my decisions and things that I liked and the things that I found that made me feel creative, you know. I think it maybe opened my eyes to being more, seeing things more that maybe I wouldn't have seen if I hadn't have had my eyes opened, if that makes any sense. After we moved away from Colorado, which I lived there for 13 years, we were living on the East Coast in New Hampshire. At the time, was in therapy pretty heavily, just trying to, you know, figure some stuff out. And one of the things that my therapist said to me, she said, "Have you ever painted your feelings? These things that we talk about, have you ever done that?" And I was like, "No, not really." You know, I hadn't thought about it being the point. And she said, "Well, I really think you could do some great stuff if you can tap into that." And honestly, she wasn't the first person that ever said that to me, but she was the first person that I actually heard it from. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do that. And so I literally just decided that I would take watercolor, because that's something that I'm self-taught in. I've had formal training in watercolor, but that's more traditional use of watercolor, and I don't use it that way. So I just decided I'm going to just take this bold step. I'm going to do it in watercolor, and I'm going to do it my way. And so what I did is I would just take a piece of paper, lay it down on my table, and just honestly stare at it. And then I would think, okay, how am I feeling right now? When I'm thinking about a certain issue that I'm having that I would talk to with my therapist. And then I would think, okay, how am I feeling in that moment? And I would just try to think of how I could take that from here and put it onto here. And I ended up doing like 30 pieces that is probably what I feel one of the greatest bodies of work that I've done so far in my life. Because what it did for me was not only did it let me play with this medium and make it work for me the way I wanted it to work, but it was like I had control. It was about the control of it. And I think that is what was therapeutic about it. Not only the content of what these paintings are, but the process of it was just very therapeutic. And I couldn't be more grateful to have had that experience. So that was probably where I was at the time. Again, not showing, not being out there as an artist, just creating because I have to create. And so after that period of doing the watercolors, I wanted to take it a step further and try doing acrylic paintings again. And what I found is that my work is really more about evolution, my evolution as an artist. I mean, I can repaint the same things if you want that, but that's not really what I do. I literally, each painting that I do is kind of the stepping stone for the next painting or the next direction that I go in, because I can be doing a watercolor and something will happen almost even by accident, and it like turns this light on over my head, you know, saying, wow, you need to remember what just happened here and apply this in another painting. And then I will do that. And in the process of doing that in my next painting, it like opens my eyes to another thing that I could do. And so it's always growing, because now I'm to the point, not meaning to jump ahead, but what I'm doing currently is I am using acrylic and watercolor together on canvas. And it's amazing how it turns out. And so, and again, it's also evolving. Even though I'm where I'm at with it now, I also am already seeing changes in it. So I'm excited to see where it's going to go, because I don't really, know that part. Because I also feel that art, because people say, where does it come from? How do you do that? And I'll be honest with you, I don't know where it comes from. I just feel like that the art I create is just something that I have inside of me that needs to come out through the ends of my fingers. And I still have a ton of stuff in here that hasn't been created yet. And I don't know what it's going to be, but I know there's more there. And so I'm just open to whatever comes up, and just, it's more of a challenge and enjoyable for me if I don't know what I'm doing or don't know how to use the medium or whatever. I like to just play with it. And I've made lots of mistakes and created a lot of horrible art that nobody will ever see, you know what I mean? But I've grown through all of that. So I actually enjoy the mistakes, and I actually appreciate harsh critiques, because for me, if you look at a piece of my work, if you say, oh, that's pretty, I love that, I'm like, okay. But if you say to me, oh, I like that, but this or that, then it helps me see it differently. And then I can be like, and I learn from that. And so I'm like, okay, I see what you're saying. And so that kind of developed in my 30s, that attitude toward my work, because I guess as a younger person, I always wanted, confirmation that I was good or that I was, doing the right thing or whatever. But the older I get, the, less that is for me. And it actually is more helpful to hear the opposite, because then I feel like I'm still growing. Otherwise, I'm just painting and it's not really moving people. I want art to provoke something, whether it's happy or sad or confused or whatever it is. I want it to provoke something. It can't just be pretty. You have to have more than that, in my opinion. When I was in my 40s, again, that was kind of a weird time in my life because I was still moving around quite a bit, which is not the best environment for somebody that's trying to be an artist and get established and all of that kind of stuff. And so a lot of, my 40s was really about travel. I traveled a lot and getting inspired through places that I've traveled. That's really what's taken me to where my art is today, because my biggest muse is a tree. I'm super inspired by it, of all forms, shapes, sizes, all of it. Trees just always are very inspirational to me. And so landscape, my work has shifted more from portrait type of stuff to more landscape things. And working with the acrylic and the watercolor together, I'm able to create some pretty amazing landscapes with heavy texture. But so that period of my life, I really just started developing more my skills in landscaping and doing skies. That was another thing about Colorado that I wanted to mention that was so inspiring for me, is the sky there, because the sky is so large, it's like it swallows you whole. And people that don't understand that, it's like, I grew up in Virginia where there's lots of trees and everything's kind of close in together and it's beautiful, but in Colorado where it's all open and it's flat, and so the sky just seems huge. And so things like watching a storm go across the Front Range, if you're in the mountains, you can actually see an entire storm move across the Front Range, and those kinds of things inspire me. Clouds are one of the most spectacular things I think is out there. And so mix that with a sunset or a sunrise or a storm, and I just want to paint. And so all of my travels through my 40s really set me up for where I am right now and what I'm painting right now and what I'm doing right now. I think with my art, it's really about capturing more of a moment in time. And the reason for that, I think, is a lot of my landscapes, I just make it up out of my own head. I don't have a specific picture that I use for inspiration, or I've never actually sat outside and did plein air stuff. I've never done anything like that. And so for me, it's about capturing a moment that I have in my head that I'm creating this space. That's probably a more accurate description, although I will say that I have done quite a bit of work that would definitely be more in the movement genre. It was created with intention to speak loudly to certain people or a certain topic. Which is part of what made that watercolor series that I told you about with my therapist that she inspired me to do. It was very much that. I would definitely say it was more of a movement as far as that kind of thing goes. But that's not my intention when I paint. Usually it's just more a moment, I think, in time than anything. I like to think that I capture a feeling. I don't ever want to try to force a viewer to see my art a certain way. My intention, so this might put me in the movement category is why I'm saying it, is, my intention when I paint is I want you to feel something, but I don't want to force that on you. I want you to just feel it naturally because you connect with it. So that's probably more what it's about for me. So I don't know if that really answers the question or not, because again, sometimes it is more about the movement and sometimes it's more about the moment in time. But probably more the moment in time for me is more of what my art is. Well, this is, and I've said this to many young artists because I have done some, I've worked with kids and a few places I've lived and like volunteer stuff. And I have told this to many artists. You know, art is, don't ever let anybody tell you how to do your art. Don't ever let anybody tell you that your art is good or bad. Don't listen to any of that, because the moment you do, I think you get caught up in a wheel that produces not great art, whether it's music or what your form is. Because I find personally as an artist, when I am doing my own thing, creating what I want to create, how I want to create it, that's usually when I create my best stuff. When I'm asked to be, you know, to do things a certain way, or, you know, change this or change that, you can tell it's forced and it doesn't have a flow to it that makes it enjoyable, or what I find attracts people to a piece of my art. And so that's very important to me, to let it just come naturally and not force it, because, you know, challenge yourself. I'm not saying, you know, get stuck, but, you know, try things that you've never tried before and just fail at it, you know, because I think failure is what makes me the artist I am today. Because, you know, through learning that you can't do this and this together because the outcome is not good, but if you do this and this together, then you got this amazing thing, you know, and all of that is just discovered through not being afraid to play with the materials, you know. And because so many people have said to me, oh, I can't even draw a stick figure. Well, I don't even draw great stick figures, to be honest. But, you know, I just look at art as there's so many forms of it. You know, you can be a great cook, and to me, that's artistic, because I can't do that. You know, you can be a musician, and that's a huge art form, you know, but for me, it's just painting and drawing. And if I can get somebody to connect with that, then I think that's what's important. And so that's what I try to tell other artists when they ask me, you know, like why I do art or what drives me. You know, I just think it's important not to get what I call caught up in the machine of it all, because then you can't, it's hard to be your authentic self. And I think being your authentic self when you're creating is the most important thing. So I try to steer people in that direction, because I think it's hard, because, you know, you get caught up in the what people want and what people think is good. And like for instance, I can give you is like when I moved here, this is the best example. Every place I was going, they're like, well, do you have any paintings of the bridges? Do you have any paintings of, you know, the river? And I'm like, no, because that's not what I do. But that's what they want, because that's what they can sell. And so if I want to be that kind of artist, not that there's anything wrong with it, but if I want to crank out art that is going to sell like that, then, you know, you can do that. But it doesn't satisfy me as an artist. You know, I have done a few bridge paintings since I've been here. They're some of my least favorite pieces, because I feel that it was a forced thing and not something that just naturally came to me that I wanted to do. And so I just think that's a super important rule to have for yourself as an artist, is just be true to yourself and do what you want to do, and don't let anybody tell you how to do your art, because you're going to create some amazing stuff if you just let it come naturally, I think. Well, so many young artists that I've worked with, I've heard it so many times. They will look at my work and they'll say, oh, I can't draw a person like that. I can't do that. And then I'll say, well, show me how you do it. And they would show me, they would draw a person or they would do whatever. And I would say, because in my eyes, the way that I look at art like that, I thought, well, what's wrong with that? That looks pretty amazing. And they're like, yeah, but it don't look like yours. And I'm like, well, you know, it don't have to look like mine to be great art. It can be great in just the way you do it. And then I give examples. I'm like, look at how, like, say, Picasso paints an elephant. opposed to how you paint an elephant. Does that make his better than yours? No, it just makes it your way. And so just don't ever get hung up on trying to look like somebody else's or trying to look like a photograph, because some of the greatest art in the world don't look like any of that stuff. And so that's what I encourage the younger artists to focus on, because I think they tend to get hung up on the, it don't look real, or it's odd shaped, or, and it's like, perfection is probably the enemy of art, in my opinion. The more that it's not, I think the better it is, because it's more real. So that's the way I look at it.